Okay, let's unpack this. You've probably seen how major global events,
Yeah.
political stuff, conflicts, trade disputes, they send ripples through financial markets.
Absolutely.
Finance is designed to understand geopolitical risk, right?
Supposedly, yes.
But what if there's one truly massive, potentially world-altering risk, one that could wipe out trillions, that the global financial system seems to be almost completely ignoring?
It's a fascinating paradox, really. I mean, this is a sector built on sophisticated risk modeling, looking at everything from supply chains to currencies.
Right.
Yet, when you look at the material you've gathered for this deep dive, there's this just glaring blind spot around the most existential threat we face.
Exactly. So this deep dive is all about that blind spot,
Right.
the staggering financial risks of nuclear war.
Yep.
We've pulled together this stack of articles, research, our notes, your sources, to figure out why nuclear risk is being called a trillion-dollar blind spot.
Okay.
What the material reveals about its potential impact, who's ignoring it, and, well, if there's any movement towards change.
So let's dive into the findings then.
Right into it. The material you've shared, it doesn't really mince words.
Yeah.
It points out that while the financial sector is hyper-aware of, many geopolitical dynamics, there's a near total lack of serious engagement with the risk of nuclear conflict.
And what's particularly striking, I think, is that it's not just like a passive oversight.
No.
No, the data shows active investment. Financial institutions are pouring billions into the companies that actually build nuclear weapons.
Billions. Okay, let's get specific with the numbers from the research.
Absolutely. As of 2024, the findings show investors held over $513 billion
Wow.
in shares and bonds of these nuclear weapons companies. And this isn't some tiny niche thing. 260 financial institutions are still involved.
$500 billion, 260 institutions. The sources describe this pretty provocatively, don't they? Calling it betting on Armageddon or...
Yeah, or gambling on deterrence without calculating the odds.
It really highlights the cognitive dissonance, doesn't it?
It does. A sector dedicated to managing risk is making these colossal investments in the very thing that could unravel everything.
And this failure to assess risk,
Yeah.
it isn't just limited to direct investment. Right?
Yeah.
Your material points out issues with really fundamental financial tools, like credit rating agencies.
Yeah, this is where the blind spot becomes almost, well, absurd.
How so?
Credit rating agencies are treating nuclear-armed states, countries with prime targets inside them, the same way they treat nations that are actively part of nuclear-free zones.
So they just ignore it.
It seems like it. They ignore if a country is in a nuclear weapon-free zone or if it hosts high-priority nuclear targets.
Give us the specific concrete example from the material. That usually helps.
Okay, so the articles highlight New Zealand. It's firmly in the South Pacific nuclear-free zone.
Right.
It holds the same credit rating as the UK.
Okay. But the UK is a nuclear-armed state.
Exactly. Hosting Trident submarines, making it a high-value target. And the major financial hubs themselves, like London and New York, they're explicitly identified as prime targets in the analysis.
Yet no difference in the rating compared to New Zealand.
None reflected in the national credit ratings. It just doesn't track with how they assess other, frankly, far less catastrophic risks.
Okay, so the credit agencies have a blind spot. What about insurers? They're supposed to be the last line of defense against these huge tail risks, right? These incredibly unlikely but devastating events.
Well, insurers have largely punted on this risk entirely.
Blunted.
Yeah. The research shows most policies include blanket exclusions for nuclear events. The analogy used in the sources is pretty powerful. They're treating a vineyard in Wellington, New Zealand,
Low-risk area.
with the same nuclear risk assessment as a bank on Wall Street in New York.
A prime target.
Worlds apart in terms of actual risk, yet the insurance response is identical, just exclusion.
That sounds like a massive, unaddressed vulnerability for the whole system. The material even quotes Berkshire Hathaway's Ajit Jain on this, doesn't it?
Yes, Ajit Jain expressed significant concern. He talked about the lack of ability to really estimate what our real exposure is if a nuclear attack were to happen.
So they know they don't know.
Pretty much. And here's a crucial detail from the sources. Despite those exclusions in the policies,
Yeah.
Jain believes regulators would likely step in after an event. They'd force insurers to cover secondary effects. He anticipates regulators would essentially rewrite the contracts and we will be required to pay.
So it's not really an excluded risk in practice then. It's more like an uncalculated one where the potential liabilities gets kicked down the road.
Exactly. Kicked down the road, potentially onto regulators, and ultimately, well, society.
The gamble.
Precisely. It's a gamble that the catastrophe either won't happen, or if it does, the fallout, both literal and financial, can somehow be managed or shifted onto someone else.
And the material you've gathered makes it really clear that the risk isn't static. It's actually increasing.
Yeah, that's a key finding. Geopolitical tensions are rising, and what some call the nuclear taboo seems to be eroding.
How so? What's the evidence?
Well, the evidence presented includes leaders in several countries, Finland, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, Poland, openly discussing or supporting increased nuclear capabilities or readiness.
So more talk about getting nukes, not getting rid of them.
Right. And at the same time, China is rapidly expanding its nuclear stockpile.
That shift in public discourse, it feels like a major change noted in the analysis. And the risk estimates cited are pretty stark.
They offer different perspectives, yeah, but none are exactly comforting. BlackRock's geopolitical risk dashboard back in early 2025 included nuclear weapons risks in 3 of its top 10 global risks.
3 out of 10, wow.
And Warren Buffett, known for his pragmatic risk assessment, he's warned that these risks are real, unpredictable, and profoundly underestimated.
The sources mention his own personal estimate, which was unsettling just because he'd even calculated it, right?
Right. His personal estimate was like 0.01% probability, which sounds tiny.
Tiny, but...
But the fact that someone like Buffett even puts a non-zero number on it, given the consequences, that's noteworthy. But other estimates in the material are significantly higher.
This is...
The CIA reportedly told President Biden back in 2022 that the probability of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons could be as high as 50% under certain specific conditions.
50%? Good grief.
And a 2024 survey of experts cited in the sources estimated the risk of nuclear war at 5% within the next 2 decades.
Okay, 5% within 2 decades is a world away from 0.01%. It really underscores another warning from Buffett mentioned in the material. Something about accidents.
Yeah, he warned, there are going to be more accidents in connection with atomic weapons.
Which points to risks beyond just deliberate first-use miscalculation, tech failure.
Exactly, or an escalation spiral getting totally out of control. And the potential financial and economic consequences detailed in the sources are, well, quite simply apocalyptic in scope.
Let's spell out what the research suggests would happen. Just lay it out.
Okay. The analysis projects consequences like, well, the collapse of global supply chains.
Total collapse.
Decimation of food production on a planetary scale.
Planetary.
And the wiping out of trillions. Yes, trillions in economic value. It would also directly jeopardize billions invested in real estate and equity markets, especially in targeted financial centers like London and New York.
The material gives a really specific, almost chilling modern example of this, doesn't it? How our interconnectedness makes us vulnerable.
It does. That example of a tactical strike on Shenzhen's ports.
Right, the tech hub.
Because of modern just-in-time logistics, where manufacturing relies on these precise global supply chains, such a strike wouldn't just affect China.
No, it ripples out.
It could paralyze global tech manufacturing for the foreseeable future. It shows how a seemingly limited event in one key spot could cause immediate, cascading, worldwide financial and economic paralysis.
Okay, so with this escalating risk and these dire potential consequences laid out in your sources,
Yeah.
what's being done? Anything? Are there efforts towards transparency or forcing a reassessment?
Well, there's a significant development at the UN level, finally.
Okay.
The material notes that in November 2024, 144 nations, and importantly, including China,
China too? Interesting.
voted to conduct the first comprehensive study on the economic and environmental consequences of nuclear war since the Cold War era.
That sounds like a really necessary step just to get a modern picture. But the sources also highlight resistance to this study, right?
They do. Nuclear-armed states like the United Kingdom and France notably refused to participate. They dismissed the study as unnecessary.
Unnecessary. Why would they resist getting a clearer picture of the consequences? The material offers an interpretation, I think.
Yeah, the analysis suggests that while some might genuinely feel the costs are already, well understood, acknowledging the full modern financial and economic impact might expose what the sources call the absurdity of spending billions on weapons that could destroy their own economies.
Right.
The question is raised, Are pension fund managers whose portfolios assume cities like London will always be insurable truly aware of these uncalculated risks?
So acknowledging the financial impact could force some very uncomfortable questions about current policy.
Precisely.
It circles back to that blind spot, doesn't it?
Mm.
Is there any indication that change is happening within the financial sector itself, maybe driven by pressure?
The sources definitely point to the immense power the financial sector holds through ethical investment choices. Campaigns like Don't Bank on the Bomb.
I've heard of them.
They've been actively campaigning and pressuring firms to divest from nuclear weapons manufacturers.
And has that pressure had any measurable effect, according to the data you found?
Yes, there's some movement, apparently. The number of financial institutions invested in these companies has dropped slightly, from 287 down to 260 since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, entered into force.
So a drop, but still 260 institutions.
Still a lot, yeah. But the sources suggest that nuclear weapons are slowly starting to be seen as toxic assets.
Toxic assets, that's a potent framing.
Yeah, not just ethically toxic, but financially and reputationally too,
Right.
making fewer institutions willing to hold them in their portfolios.
Are the major players feeling this pressure, the big names?
Definitely. Large asset managers like Vanguard, Capital Group, BlackRock, they're specifically mentioned as facing pressure from ethically minded investors and activists.
Okay.
And the shift is even starting to appear in standard investment tools. Morgan Stanley Capital International's ESG methodology, for instance.
ESG, environmental, social governance.
Right. Their methodology now penalizes companies involved in manufacturing nuclear warheads, missiles, or components used exclusively in nuclear weapons.
So the cracks are starting to show, maybe. But it sounds like a slow process against a deeply ingrained financial structure.
That seems to be the picture the sources paint, yes. Slow, but maybe moving.
Okay, so bringing it all together
Yeah.
and looking back at the core question we started with, why is the global financial sector, which prides itself on sophisticated risk management, failing so badly, it seems, to adequately factor in the geopolitical risks of nuclear war?
It really remains the central, baffling paradox highlighted throughout the material, doesn't it?
It does. Hundreds of billions are currently invested in what fundamentally amounts to a global nuclear deterrence gamble.
A gamble that, if it fails, well, it carries potentially trillion-dollar consequences, not to mention the human cost, which is almost incalculable.
Just staggering.
The sources leave us with a really powerful concluding thought on this. They argue that given the immense stakes and the sheer scale of the investment, the very least banks and financial institutions should be doing is calculating the actual odds of that gamble failing.
The very least, calculate the odds.
Wow.
This deep dive has really pulled back the curtain on this massive blind spot regarding nuclear risk that your sources highlight. We've seen the sheer scale of investment,
$500 billion.
the documented failures in risk assessment by key players like credit agencies, insurers,
Just ignoring it or excluding it.
the undeniable escalation of global nuclear tensions, and the truly catastrophic potential economic fallout detailed in the material.
And we've touched on the pushback against even addressing this risk, even as efforts like the UN study try to bring transparency. Plus, that slow but growing movement within finance itself, driven by ethical concerns.
It leaves you with a lot to think about, doesn't it? I mean, for you listening, considering the huge financial implications laid out in the sources, what does it truly mean when the global financial system isn't calculating the odds of arguably the biggest risk it faces?
Yeah, what happens to that $500 billion bet if the gamble on deterrence ultimately fails?